This is Endless Engines, a 3D art competition hosted by Clinton Jones, also known as Punisher. The prompt is to make a 3D vehicle in the world that it's in. You can literally do anything, and you want to be as creative as possible. He's done a few of these in the past, but I didn't know 3D. But now I've got some experience, and I want to give it a shot. So without further ado, here's how I made my submission to Endless Engines. So what am I gonna do? Well, I don't want to make a normal vehicle, so let me show you what I have in mind. It starts with a toaster rolling in, then two jets pop out and it flies away. I know it's weird, but at least it's unique. And now that it's all planned out, we can finally start day one. It started out pretty simple. I downloaded the Endless Engines template and I got to work. The first thing I did was work on the toaster, which is the subject of the render. But I forgot what a toaster looked like, so I had to find a reference image. But once I had this, I had a pretty clear vision of what the toaster in my render was going to look like. I was pretty rusty at 3D modeling, so it took me a whole hour to make this toaster. There was a lot of messy geometry, but I didn't really care and I was pretty happy with the model. So, on to day 2. I was tired of making the toaster, so I decided to make the road. My plan was to make one chunk of the road, and then I can just make a bunch of copies until it's a full road. In Blender, this is called an array. This modifier lets you duplicate the mesh without actually having to duplicate the geometry, which is really good for your computer, and it lets you do it as many times as you want. Like here, there's 50 cubes, but they're only copies of one of them. That means there's only one unique mesh, which is why you can make so many without it slowing down your computer. Anyway, back to day 2. The whole road is in place, but it could really use some textures. To do this, I'm going to use something called UV projection mapping. This is pretty much just when you slap a flat image onto a mesh, and it looks pretty good. But then we can take it a step further for that nicer realism. To do that, we need to use nodes. We already got the UV map plugged in and rearranged to where it looks nice, so now we can move on to other ones. The first one is the normal map, which pretty much just tells the faces how to react with light. Next up is the roughness map, which I think explains itself. And the final one for this example is the displacement map. This map says what spots should be extruded to make it look more realistic. Once you've done all that, you can zoom out and look at the mess you just made. And if it's confusing, I understand, because I just learned how to do this when working on this project. Anyways, back to day 2. I got the street textured and I also made a sidewalk. Then I got the toaster textured and made it follow along the preset animation. And that wraps up day 2. So, on to day 3. With my newfound mastery of UV projection mapping, I decided to redo the street and sidewalk. To make these textures look more realistic, I used bump maps. These make it look like there's fine detail in the texture, while really there's no displacement to the mesh at all. Day 3 was pretty quick, but on day 4, things really started to come together. I started to make the houses that are going to surround the street. This is the rough model of the first house, just made up of a lot of simple geometry. You can see how I used the reference image to make the shape of the house. This is also what I'm going to be doing for the rest of the houses. I started texturing the house with the techniques talked about before, but then it crashed, which made me really sad. But it's okay, because I eventually finished the brick, roofing, windows, and everything else to get this final product. This was my first time making a house, and I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. Although it's looking pretty good, we're just getting started. Day 5 was mostly spent making the second house. I was able to use this part of house 1 as the base for house 2. This was useful, because the longer this challenge went on, the more shortcuts like this I had to find. This is because I didn't have a lot of time. Day 5 was on February the 24th, and the deadline was on March 12th. And I'm busy in real life, and I can't spend all my time working on this project. And you've seen the title, so you know I only have 5 days to wrap up this render. And with that in mind, I finished up the model, but the texture still needed some work. Once this house was finished, I was ready to move on to day 6. This was a really big day. I started off blocking out the scene, just so I could see how many more houses I would have to make. Next up, to fill up the scene a bit, and really to hide my bad modeling, I decided to make some trees. I watched CG Geek's video on how to make a tree in 1 minute. And let me just say, this man is a genius. The video shows how to make a simple tree in an easy to understand way. And to me, this just shows how there's always an easier way to do something in Blender. Also, there's only 2 unique trees in the entire render. I just rotated and scaled them differently to make it less noticeable. After that, I moved on to making a fence using arrays. These were used to separate the houses so that they would take up more space. And the final thing I did this day was make house 3. The way I made this one was exactly the same as the other 2. The only difference is that this time I used an add-on I just discovered called Orcamesh. This add-on has a bunch of customizable assets that are commonly used in architectural design. This really helped me speed up a lot because I didn't have to worry about things like doors and windows anymore, which are pretty complex to model. I got a lot done today, and I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. And with all that done, we move on to day 7. To start it off, I textured house 3 and put it into the scene. Next, I realized that there was no sky in the render, so I decided to make one in Blender. And long story short, it just didn't work. But don't worry, we're gonna get a sky eventually, but that's gonna have to wait. Because right now, we're doing something completely different. And because I now have a good feeling of the setting, we can finally start animation. Doing this was probably the most fun part. It was a lot of trial and error and just testing things out, but when it worked, it was really satisfying. Technically, it was kind of confusing, just because all the keyframes were stacked on top of each other. I was very much out of my comfort zone, but it was a lot of fun to learn. And right now, the animation didn't make much sense, because there was nothing keeping it in the air, which is why I made jets. These were especially difficult to model, just because they were spherical, and most of the things I've been making have been cubic. Eventually I figured it out, and I got to move on to animating it. I made it kind of like a nesting doll in order for it to totally fit into the toaster. And once they were put into the scene, it looked way more realistic. A lot got done today, but we still need to move on to day 8. All that really happened this day was that I made house 4, and as I'm doing it, I realized how much better and faster I'm getting at making things in Blender. And to be honest, this is probably the best model of really anything I've ever made. But then again, I still took shortcuts on the side of the house that you're not going to see, because that deadline was really coming up quick. And because of this, I had to put the finishing touches on my render, and so that's where we're going to pick up on day 9. To fill up the scene more, I added a lot more trees between the houses. This made it feel a lot more cohesive, opposed to everything's being stuck on a board. But I realized the background was still pretty empty, so I made some forests. Trying to keep it as easy on my computer as possible, I made it in a pretty weird way. I made 2 particle systems. One of the tree trunk, and then the other of the leaves. When you stick them together, it looks pretty convincing when they're far away from camera. The final thing I did to fill up the space was just make more houses in the background. I did this by taking the pre-existing houses I've already made and then flipping them around, and no one really knows. After that, the final thing I did in Blender was make sparks, which were surprisingly easy. So with those done, we were ready to render in Blender. And the final step in this process was sending it over to After Effects and Premiere Pro for the final touches. But I'll talk more about that in day 10. Remember when I said I was going to make a sky? Well, now I'm doing it, and it's way easier in After Effects than it is in Blender. I just found an image of a field and sky and then threw it in the background. Then with a little bit of scale keyframing, just to make it look more dynamic, it looks really good. Then I brought it into Premiere Pro for some color grading. Then after that, it was done, ready to submit. And let me just say, I had a lot of fun working on this project. And I learned a lot about 3D art, from modeling and texturing to even animation. And although I didn't do it in this challenge, next time I am going to make it in top 100. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and the only thing I ask is that you go watch another video that I've made, or just let me know in the comments what you'd like to see me do next. And with that said, I'll see you in the next one.